สวัสดีครับ I'm Point from ค้นพบ Last week we talked about courage, and given the ongoing situation, the ongoing war in Ukraine right now that has entered its third week, the war that has been started by Putin's invasion of Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I thought it would be interesting and appropriate to continue discussing on a topic of war and conflict. What is it that drives a normal, ordinary, regular human being like you and me, or a normal person, to be able to engage in these acts, in these unspeakable crimes, unspeakable acts, go to a foreign land and commit acts of murder on large scales? What is it that would drive a normal person to these levels of conflict or war? Right. First of all, I want to present this by talking about this topic by talking about two interesting psychological experiments which were done many years ago, which offer a lot of insight into our human nature, human behavior. And the results were actually quite disturbing. The results of these studies or these experiments showed very clearly that the normal average person like you and me, given the right circumstances and conditions, can actually be easily pushed or compelled to commit these unspeakable, horrendous acts or crimes or murder. The first experiment was done by Stanley Milgram, a psychologist who wanted to answer the question of what drove the Nazis to do what they did. What drove the Nazis from World War II, from Nazi Germany of World War II? What drove them to commit those unspeakable war crimes? Crimes against humanity, murder so many people on large scales like that, acts of genocide, right? Were the Nazis simply just evil, or was it perhaps something more disturbing that, as I just hinted to earlier, that could it be the case that actually normal people like you and me, under the right set of circumstances, can actually be pushed to do something like that, right? This study or this experiment was known as the blind obedience study, also I believe also known as the shock experiment, electric shock experiment. So what Stanley Milgram did was he advertised to have volunteers take part in a scientific study, and they were told that this study was done to try to understand how to develop or improve memory, right? Of course, that was not the true reason behind it, but that was what the participants or the volunteers were told. So the volunteers were split into two groups. One group being the teacher, the other group being the student. Remember, they understood, or they were told or led to believe that this was an experiment about memory, how to improve memory. So the two groups, the students and the teachers, were led into two different rooms where they would not be able to see each other, and they would be communicated by a voice system, by a radio system or something like that. Okay, and here's hint number 2. All the participants, all the test subjects, they were actually all teachers. There was actually no students, right? The student was nothing more than an actor on the other side of the room. Okay, so the volunteers, which were given or designated to be the teacher, they were led into one of the rooms where they had this panel, right? And their job was to read a set of questions where the student was then supposed to answer, Of course, again, the students were just actors or pre-recorded messages, right, that would be played back. Eventually, the students would get the answers wrong, and the teacher's job was to press a button which would give an electric shock to the other side. Quite interesting, huh? Now, the thing is, as the experiment progressed, the teacher's job was to continually press the buttons or the switches that were higher in voltage until the maximum level of 450 volts, which were pretty much death level, right? It would mean the difference between life and death. The other person would die, okay? So the experiment started, and very soon, as the student made a mistake, they would be given basic shocks. Okay, no big deal, small shocks, a small scream or a small complaint. Sorry, it was started off by a small complaint by the student. Again, nothing more but actors and recorded voices. Okay, then as the experiment progressed, those shocks would get stronger and stronger. Those complaints would start to become yelling and screaming. Okay, and by this stage, a lot of the participants or the volunteers, which were the teachers, right, which were in the group of the teachers, would look back to the experimenter who was running this experiment in a white lab coat, sitting behind the teacher, looking back, and maybe they would ask questions. Why would they need to go on, or try to protest in some shape or form? The experimenter, a man sitting in a white lab coat, a figure of authority, would then give very short but cold answers for the teacher or the participant or the volunteer to continue and go on. Now, let me ask you, right, how many of the volunteers, how many teachers went all the way to the highest level of shock? And this includes even pressing that button after the student pretended to faint, right? And you would hear a thud like that over the microphone system, and the teacher would still look back to the experimenter and protest, but the experimenter would continue to give very cold, short answers and urge the teacher to continue to press those higher and higher shocks. So the question is, how many volunteers do you think was willing to go all the way to the maximum death level shock? You probably think something along the lines of, oh, nobody would ever do that, or a few people would, right? The surprising yet disturbing answer was that about 2/3, about 66% of volunteers went all the way to the maximum level. Which begs the question, what drives somebody to do such a thing? Now, before we talk about the results, it could be argued that the teachers perhaps, or the volunteers perhaps, guessed correctly that this was an experiment and that there was really no student on the other side of the room. They're just actors, or they could have rightly guessed that they're just nothing more than actors or recorded voice messages. So this experiment was conducted in different ways in on many other occasions. And even one experiment was conducted with live puppies. This was done many years ago, so the scientists could get away with running these experiments, which in the current day and age would very unlikely pass ethical approvals. Even an experiment conducted on a live puppy, a small little dog that would be shocked, right? Similar results were shown, okay? So the results of the experiments, we can look at it in three main ways. Number one, we tend to be obedient to figures of authority. We tend to, in other words, believe what the man in the white coat tells us to do, okay? We tend to believe and follow instructions of authority figures, of the man in the white coat. Number two, it could be said that we tend to do these unspeakable crimes, unspeakable acts, if we were to get some reward from it. For example, some of the volunteers were students at university and they would promise good grades or marks on their exams, for example. Okay, so reward motive could be at play. And a third one is perhaps an important one, perhaps one of the most important results, is about the diffusion of responsibility. Because the experimenter who kept answering to the protest of the teacher or the volunteer in a cold voice for them to continue on with the experiment, he would say things such as, "Don't worry, you have signed this experiment, you have signed to perform this experiment, I will take full responsibility," right? So in other words, if we believe that there is a diffusion of responsibility, or in other words, our superiors, our commanders, our boss, or somebody in the position of authority, if we believe that they will take responsibility, then perhaps we would be willing to commit these acts. So that's very interesting insight into the nature of humans, or our human behavior. Okay, and this experiment therefore showed that it wasn't per se that the Nazis were completely evil people who committed those crimes. Of course, they were very, very cruel and evil, you could perhaps say. But fundamentally, these unspeakable acts, right, can actually be committed by the average human being like you and me. That's very, very interesting. The other experiment was performed by another psychologist, which Stanley Milgram himself knew and were friends with, I believe. His name is Philip Zimbardo, and Zimbardo is well known for his Stanford Prison Experiment. Now, I've talked about both of these experiments briefly in one of my previous videos, but I want to go a bit in more detail today. So likewise, Zimbardo wanted to understand human behavior under certain circumstances. The Stanford Prison Experiment was run and conducted as follows. There was the basement of the university where this was conducted on, I believe, of course, Stanford, where they turned the basement into a makeshift prison, right? They changed the facilities and made it look like a prison. And they had volunteers split into two groups. One group would be the prisoners, the other group would be the warders, right? So the security guards. The people in the second group, the warders or the security guards, were given full authority and could do whatever they liked, tell the prisoners, the first group, to behave in whichever way they liked, right? This experiment was supposed to be held over a period of 2 weeks, okay? And very quickly, even after the first few hours of the experiment beginning, right away you would have people who were in the warder or the security guard position already starting to bully the prisoners, already starting to show their authority, to show their dominance, to throw their weight around per se. This happened very quickly, even within the first few hours. And remember, both the prisoners and the warder, the security guard, the authority figure in this experiment, they're just average volunteers, average people like you and me, usually university students, right? As a matter of fact, the behaviors were so cruel. They would ridicule, they would humiliate, they would bully the prisoners. The behavior got so cruel that the experiment had to be terminated after just 1 week, because Zimbardo's girlfriend threatened him that she would leave him if he would not stop the experiment. So that's very interesting, isn't it? Normal human beings like you and me, when given power or when given the right circumstances, can commit these unspeakable acts. Right? Now, this experiment can show another interesting insight, which is that there is a need for us as humans to conform and to obey rules, to obey the person in the position of authority, even if they are doing acts that we know logically to be insane, to be unacceptable, to be horrible, to be horrendous, to be unspeakable, right? So that drive that all humans or most humans have to conform, to be part of a group, to obey authority figures is very strong. And these factors, from a psychological perspective, offer a very interesting insight into how normal people can be driven to fight in a war in which they have no interest in which they have no part in creating the conflict, in which they gain nothing from it, in which they literally enter a foreign land, enter the battlefield to kill their human beings, to kill their fellow human beings, right? It's actually not as far away as you would think. And that is a very interesting insight that these psychological experiments have shown. Now, they were so famous, these experiments were so famous that they were even made into a movie. I believe there used to be free links that you could watch the movie for free on the internet, but I'm not sure if those links are still available. But nonetheless, I will post the name of the movie and post the IMDb page, Internet Movie Database page, for you. And I encourage you to watch that if you have time, because it's very, very insightful. Okay. So, conflict and war. Believe me, it might be disturbing at first, understandably so. Very, very disturbing. When we first come to realize that that actually these acts are not as far away as we would like to think. You see, we like to think that, oh, me, no way. I would never be able to commit those acts. You like to think and see yourself and view yourself as a kind, loving, compassionate human being, which I'm sure you are, which many of us are, and that we would therefore never be able to commit these unspeakable acts. But trust me, the science and the experiments have shown that it's not that far away as you would think. Okay, so this is part 1 of this video. I want to end it here for now because this is explaining it from the perspective of psychology and giving case studies in these 2 famous scientific experiments. Next week, I want to continue talking about this topic, but present it from the perspective of an ignorant mind. In other words, the perspective of ego. How the ego mind, which is based on division, right? Your sense of self-concept, your ego mind, thinks in forms of what the wise teachers call duality, which is to think in division. So this is me, this is mine, that is not mine, not me, right? Me, my family, my friends, my loved ones, my country, other are just, not me. And how it thinks based on judgments, and how ignorance can lead a normal person like you and me to commit these acts. Okay, so that will be for next week's video. Hope you stay tuned for it. Thank you very much for watching. Again, be sure to check out these 2 movies which recreated these very, very interesting experiments if you do have time. And stay tuned for next week, because next week, from my perspective, is a more deep way of looking at it, a deeper level of understanding, because we talk about the ego mind and how ignorance can lead a human being to engage in such unspeakable acts of conflict and even war. Okay? Thank you very much for watching. I will see you next time. สวัสดีครับ